Welcome. For this online professional development opportunity, we're going to take some time to talk about Google Forms. Google Forms is simply a way to collect data. We're going to talk about it in terms of how to use Google Forms for both formative and summative. Honestly, we're going to probably focus more on the formative aspect and the formative uses of Google Forms. And Google Forms is a pretty user-friendly program within the Google Suite. And in order to help you with kind of the basics of Google Form, what I did is put together this help dashboard, if you will, that shows you the 20 maybe most common activities, functions that you need to know how to do in Google Forms. And I think it's worth mentioning this because as we go through this online professional development, there is going to be an expectation that you have some background with Google Forms. Most of you have answered a Google form before or responded to a Google form. We're going to focus much more on the creating of the Google form and a variety of ideas that you can use to create Google Forms, as well as encouraging you to have students build Google Forms. But this is the spot where you can go and click on any one of these, and one of two things will happen. There will be an animated GIF that will show you how to, for instance, start a Google form. Some of them have short 2 to 2.5 minute videos that kind of walk you through things. So let's get started in taking a look at Google Forms. I think a place to start is to just make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about the differences between formative and summative assessments. I'm going to use those words throughout this. Like I said, we're going to tend to focus more on the formative aspect than the summative aspect, but I do think it's important to understand the difference between them. I pulled this from Carnegie Mellon University. There are a number of, all of the definitions are essentially the same, and you notice that the definition for formative, the goal of formative assessment is to gather feedback that can be used by the instructor and the students to guide improvements in the ongoing teaching and learning context. These are low-stakes assessments for students and instructors. I think the key here becomes they help guide improvement, because formative really is an assessment that is done to gauge where the learner is at, to decide what changes and or new strategies need to be implemented. I think another important part of formative, and you will get people that will argue over this, but formative assessments are not graded. These are used to guide improvements. Okay, so a lot of times I've heard teachers say, oh yeah, I do formative assessments a lot for students. I have them do exit tickets, and then, which is fine, that formative and exit ticket might be formative, but the minute you put a grade on it, it is not considered formative anymore. Whereas a summative, as you'll notice, the goal of summative assessment is to measure the level or success of proficiency that's been attained at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. Again, this is when you put the grade on it. Now you are issuing a summative assessment. And so I think it's really important to keep these two definitions in mind, because you as a teacher need to decide, how do I want to use formative assessment? As you go through that thought process of deciding when you want to use formative assessment, I think it's worth mentioning, I don't know if you're familiar with the work by John Hattie, this visible learning. He basically went through and did a meta-analysis of studies and then tried to pinpoint what are those influences that have positive effects on students' learning all the way down to negative effects. And I think it's worth pointing out this idea of providing formative evaluation was the third highest influence that John Hattie found. So we can talk about formative versus summative assessment. There's not really a lot of argument out there. Teachers should be providing maybe more formative assessment than they actually are in class. And so, again, as we go through this Google Forms, that's the thing to keep in the back of your mind is how can you bring this in your class? I think Google Forms makes it easier to be able to bring formative assessment into class. So let's dive in now to a variety of different ways that you can use Google Forms. And as we start in on this, I want to stress, I'm not going to go into the detail on all the intricacies of building each of these forms. That's where I think understanding and building some Google Forms, the learning curve isn't real steep for it. So it really is about generating ideas. It's not you saying, oh, I want to use that exact one that he talked about. What I'm hoping will happen is you'll think about your curriculum, your grade level, your subject matter, and you'll say, that's something I can do in class. That's something that would be an easy way to do a formative assessment, or in some cases, a summative assessment. The first option here that we're going to talk about really is more for that summative, and to be quite honest, I think this is maybe going to be the one that I focus on being the summative aspect. You can use this for formative, but it is simply the, as I put here, the multiple choice, true, false, short answer. You could take your test or quizzes that you've used before, you've used in the past, and you could convert them into a Google Form format. And that would be summative. You know, the students would take it, their responses would show up here in this tab. I show some examples in that kind of help dashboard that's linked on how to go about doing this. There's nothing wrong with this, but I think this is one of those, this is really more of a substitution. If you look at the SAMR model, this becomes something more of a substitution. You're taking a test or a quiz that you've used before, and you're putting it into this format. Now, let's think about the advantages to that. Students can tell their grade right away. So I'm not knocking this, but we're hoping that you can start to see even uses beyond this for Google Forms. But you'll notice if you select this plus right here, you have some different options for different kind of questions, from short answer, paragraph, multiple choice. Checkboxes allow you to do more than one choice. Drop-down menu, that's if you have a lot of choices, it will save space because all the choices don't have to be on the screen at one time. This file upload, linear scale, multiple choice grid. So this is, in this instance, you can basically build a quiz, a test, from Google Forms. If you do that, what you can do is if you go to settings, then you can have it be a quiz. And by quiz, that's where you will pick the answer for each one of them. You have some decisions to make about what you want them to see and when you want them to see it. If you do this as a formative assessment, this immediately after each submission is kind of a good thing because it lets students know, oh, okay, I got that one wrong. And then you can, as a teacher, see how students are doing overall as a class and allow you to make those changes to your instruction and either focus on something more, or maybe you can go a little bit more quickly through something. So again, this one is really the maybe the most straightforward of the uses of Google Forms. This example is one that I call real-time data collection, for lack of a better word or phrase. And really what I mean by that is Google Forms allows you to build something, a form, that when students are presenting, when students are reading, whatever skill it is that you are assessing, it allows you to capture data. And I would also argue if you do if you have students peer evaluate each other, a great thing, because you can do this same thing if it were students doing a peer assessment. And really what it boils down to is, let me preview this form. This is one that was used by a teacher in the district last year, and she wanted to be able to see where kids were at in terms of their reading. And so as students sat down to read one-on-one with the teacher would open up this form. This is what it would look like, and they could do it very easily on their iPad. And they would say, okay, which student? They already put the students into here, so I'm, going to do Greg, and then the level is going to be a 1, and I'm just going to put the book title as test. And as they're reading, going through and saying, okay, did a good job here, did a good job here. These are the things that she knows she's looking for. The goals in the end needs to be, this self-monitor, miscue analysis, does that sound right? In this case, I'm not going to put a goal, and let's just say the text difficulty was independent. And she submits that. Okay? What she can then do is go through, and I think a couple of things can happen. One, Google Forms can be used very much for an individual assessment, either formative or summative, or it can be used for class. So she can look at this screen, and these are everybody. And let's say that every kid in the class, 25 kids, have read 5 times to this teacher. Okay? So she's filled out that number of forms. This bar graph then becomes something that, okay, there are very few kids getting strengths on read sight words, whatever it might be. That might be something then that the teacher says, okay, we need to work on that as a whole class. If these bar graphs are really distributed equally among all the students, then it becomes more of an individual kind of thing. So it's a very nice way of graphically representing where the class is at that point in time. But then what you can also do is go up here to the actual data sheet, and now here you have Brett, and let's say Brett has read 5 times. You could then sort by Brett. You then see the strengths, you see the goals, everything is right there. This becomes something then that can be shared with parents. This becomes, stuff that you talk about at the parent-teacher conferences. It's just this nice data dashboard that you can look back on. Now, some may say, well, okay, I don't know, what kind of skill do I have that I would be looking at over and over and over again? I mean, obviously reading is one of them. Think about writing skills in your class. Anything that requires somebody to do a task or a skill over and over again. I think that's a good use for this. I want to use another example. Again, it's still real-time data collection, but it might be something that teachers who maybe are in the upper elementary grades or junior high or high school might say, okay, now I see how I can use it. And in this case, I'm going to do something like a student who's giving a presentation. And let's say that you as the teacher design your course or your assessment based on a set of criteria. These are, like in this case, I put 2, voice projection and eye contact. You've talked to students about what weak voice projection is versus what's strong. You've decided on this 1 to 5 Likert scale. Same thing with eye contact. So the students stand up and present, and Dan is going to present, so you're going to say his voice projection really was kind of weak and his eye contact was a 5, and you're going to submit that. submit another response. The next person gets up, and, it's Abby, and she had a weak voice and weak eye contact, and you submit that. Now, what you can do is, as a teacher, similar to what the teacher dealing with the reading responses, is you can go here to responses, and let's say you did this as a formative. Let's say you had talked about eye contact and voice projection and all of those presentation skills. You could go, and as a teacher, you could see where the class is as a whole. And in this case, let's say that this is how it turned out after 25 to 30 students went. I would say as a teacher, the formative assessment I'm giving is showing that they have some difficulty with voice projection. We probably should work on that as a class. Again, if it's distributed equally amongst this, then it's going to be something that is more individual students. But it allows you to be able to lump some students together. Let's take the students who are having some difficulty and have them work on something, and the students that are doing fine in terms of voice projection, they don't need any extra work. They don't need any extra help. You're going to have them do something else. Same thing with eye contact. Or you can go in and, just like the reading one, you can hopefully show growth. And so if I go here and I select everything and I say data and I want to sort range, and I want to say I want to sort by student name. Now I've got Abby, and here's where it looks like the first time, that's strange, the first time her speech was actually better, or her voice projection and eye contact were better the first time than they were the second time. Again, as a teacher, that's at least going to give me some room to pause and say, I wonder why that is. And in this case, you had a regression here on voice projection and growth on eye contact. And if you think about it, if you keep track of this for every student, every presentation, then you have this set of data where you can show, hopefully, growth over time. So I think Google Forms is great for that. And again, because it is so fairly easy to create one of these forms for this, I think it's worth taking a look at for use in your classes. The next use of Google Forms is probably the one I use the most when I was in the classroom, and I call it just the class snapshot. This is such an easy way of capturing how students feel about a question or questions, topics that you're talking about, characters, feelings. Just so many ways of using this. And what I like about it is it's very quick. It's an easy way of being able to see where your class is at. I used to use it when in the war unit, when I was teaching American Studies. Courtney Edelman and I would give the students this values in a time of war. And essentially we were talking about the controversies of war. And we would give them this, here's a potential target list, and you need to decide on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being it is completely unjustified to bomb these targets, or 10, it's completely justified. Now, you could have them for each question, stand up, move to a side of the room, and sometimes we did that. But if you put these into a Google form that, essentially is this, now I just did a 1 to 5, but you get a very quick capture of where they're at. And, it would look this way if we look at the preview. How do you feel about this topic? So if it was those values in a time of war, okay, I strongly disagree with this one. I strongly agree with this one. I strongly disagree with this one, and then submit. Now, you go to the responses, and here's what's nice. You now see right there, question number 1, here's how the class feels. That then should bring up points for discussion. Why is it that the class there's nobody middle ground in this one. Why is it that we have people on either side? And that's how it worked. We would have some that would work out that everybody was in the 4 or 5 range. So what would it take to be a 1? Why isn't it a 1? Why is it that very few people argue with this, and so that's why it comes up as a 4 or a 5? Just a great way to generate discussion in a class. And one of the best things I think about it is I thought I might know where my class was at in terms of, if I'd had them for a whole semester and now I'm going to present them with this kind of snapshot idea. And sometimes it would just, it would surprise me. Now, in this case, I think this can be used truly as a formative assessment. This class snapshot could be, how do you feel about using commas? How do you feel about this particular equation? How do you feel about, it could just be anything that's content related. How do you feel about understanding the causes of World War I, World War II, the Civil War, whatever it might be? It's a very quick way, it could be used as an exit ticket, but a very quick way of being able to see responses from the class as a whole. Again, you can, if you have them sign in, and that's another thing we really haven't talked about on a Google form. If you say, I'm going to collect email addresses for this one, now the responses become, I would say, more useful, in that you not only see the class summary, but now you can see, and particularly if it's content related, now you can see, okay, the class seems to understand this as a whole, but I've got a few people out there that don't seem to understand it. Now you look at the individual results of what people and students put, and now you can then, as always, target that differentiation of how are you going to handle these 4 or 5 students that are really struggling with this. Now, for the values in a time of war, I really didn't care about what each individual felt. I used it as a discussion starter. And so this is one of those where I think if you really think about the class snapshot and using that in terms of your class, you could use this, quite honestly, you could use this every day. You could have this as an exit ticket. You could have this as an entrance ticket. You could have it, in the middle of class. It's such a nice, easy way of being able to capture where classes are at. I also might add, when I was teaching and I had, let's say, 3 classes of American history, this right here became interesting because I would do one Google form for each class, but then I would show the differences between the classes. So in 3rd hour, I'd had American history 3 times. Why is it that 3rd hour tended to be 4s and 5s, and why is it that the other hours tended to be 1s and 2s? And so, again, it's just a great discussion starter, and I would encourage you to try to incorporate that in some way. This can also be what students develop. If students make one of these on something that they've presented to the class, and then they get the class snapshot of where they're at. So again, I think something worth trying. I think one of the most useful aspects of Google Forms is the ability to use pictures and overall visuals. So the old Google Forms, if you're someone who this kind of whole thing doesn't look familiar, I don't know, maybe start of 2016, Google changed Google Forms, and it's spectacular, I think, in terms of the visual portion. And again, in this case, you can put in, you'll notice, and I think this is thanks to Mary Holmgren, here's this picture of something under a microscope, and so you can, as a formative assessment, so you've talked about this as a class, and you can go in here and say, well, what is this? and, onion or apple, or, you could have as many choices as you want. You could do these as a quiz, like we've talked about before, so that there is a right or wrong answer, or you could do it as a preview activity. So if people didn't know what this is, they had no way of really knowing what this is, this could be more of that preview activity. It gives you the ability of putting in, readings that you might want the students to look at. And in this case, the question, what's the main idea of the highlighted, I should have put highlighted. Oh, I did, the highlighted passage. And you see that I was able to draw this around it, and now you've got the long answer text. And so this is a way of building in, it doesn't just have to be multiple choice, is it this, this, or this? It can allow for students to do some reading and then responding. It allows you to, I did this, which of the following was painted by Grant Wood? And again, if you're that art teacher and you've talked about this, it can be a way of assessing knowledge. But it can also be a way of kind of being a repository of visuals, of videos. And I think sometimes we think about Google Forms, and it is that place where you tend to want responses back, and you could still do that. You could go in and say, I am going to put a YouTube video, that's this add video, and I'm going to use the example I did in one other one. I'm going to put the War of 1812. I'm going to do this History Channel one. Let's do this one. The 3-minute history. And now I'm going to actually make this another question. So this is, 1812. And then I'm going to put a question underneath that. And in this case, it could be to, provide a reaction to that video from the War of 1812. So it's a repository of videos in that here are the things that I want students to watch, but I could also make it a reaction. I could also make it so that, if I wanted to use any of these question choices, I could do that. Something that students could build as well. They could put together, whether it be from reading, whether it be from an image, but again, the graphical, the being able to put a graphic representation of things in here, I think has made Google Forms just an amazing medium for that. This, I've just given examples of how it becomes the question. So for instance, here, I just put in a visual. Well, I can also put a visual. If you look at Onion and to the right of it, there's this image box. And if I say, this would be kind of like what I did with the paintings, I can also go here and say, and this is just the first picture that came up. Now, I can put that, I can not only have a picture as the main part of the question, but now I can insert pictures within the answer set. And so if I preview this, here's what it looks like. And, so I do know that this is an onion. I would type out the main idea. This is the Grant Wood. And then again here, and I submit it. Now, what I can do is, there are my responses. So I can see, now the main idea, a little bit more difficult because the reading involved, but here you're going to get some graphs of, okay, it looks like people understand that. But then I also have the ability of, okay, here's what, if I have them sign in, if I'm capturing their username, then I can see what specific answers the person had. So don't forget about the pics and visuals. I think that is an important part of Google Forms. I think it's something, you can use a visual, a picture, or a video in any one of the formats that I've talked about. If you wanted to do a build your own story and you wanted to do that build your own story around pictures or videos or something like that, you could easily do that in that case. So again, might be worth trying. This next use for Google Forms is really more of a creative use of Google Forms. This is one that you as a teacher could do. You could have students, what I call build their own story, that choose your own adventure idea, whether it be, the old game Oregon Trail. This one does take a little bit more of a thought process. It does take a little bit more of a planning out strategy. It also requires the skill, a little bit higher skill level working with forms, because you deal with sections. And again, I do mention that on the help dashboard that is linked on the main document. But essentially what you're doing is, and I'll use an example. If we go to preview. So here's what they're presented with at first. As I walked into the house, I turned right. And then you do next. And now it says turning right, I was in the kitchen. I had the choice of drinking milk or soda, and I chose milk. Now, I didn't go and build out this whole thing, but I want you to notice how the questions are. This was a multiple choice question. I inserted an image into it, but here's where it's different. If you chose right, it's going to make you go to section 3. If you chose left, it's going to make you go to section 2. So you'll notice I have built in these sections as the destination of the previous choice. And again, the more you think about this, you can do truly amazing things with this, but it does take some sketching out. In fact, when I was in some Google training and we were doing this, we worked in a group doing this. Again, the learning curve's a little bit steeper for this, but once you understand Google Forms, it really is not a difficult thing. What we found to be easy was filling out like a graphic organizer so that we could graphically see what are the choices going to be. What's going to happen if they choose this one, and then, okay, we're going to have 25 sections, and if you pick this one, you have to link it to section 4, and then if you pick number 4, you have to link that to section number 12. It's not hard. It just takes a little bit more time. But I'll tell you, it is, if you are the creative type, and I'll be honest, we all are creative. Some of us use our creativity more than others. You really can do some pretty neat things here. In this case, I will say that the responses aren't going to be as helpful. In fact, I don't know that they're going to be helpful at all. If you look at the responses here, you might see, if you're just doing this for pure fun, okay, we see that, 100% of the people turned right. There might be a way, or not might, there is a way where you could build this based upon the content, so that if you chose an answer, that's showing that there's a level of understanding. Now, what you'd have to be careful of is a build your own story really is and should be a build your own story. There's another way that we can, and I'll show you, that we can formatively assess using this kind of style. But in this case, you could have students design a build your own story. And they can get complex because there is no limit to the number of responses that someone can get. So it's one of those things that as you and or your class get a little bit more versed in Google Forms, you might give this a try. It might be something I never have been a big believer in extra credit, didn't do extra credit when I was in the classroom. my belief truly is that a student's grade should be based upon the content that you're teaching, but you could use something like this as an extra assignment, if you will. Or if you're someone who does give extra credit, you could make this related to the content. So your students who maybe are at a higher level, they maybe understand the story that you've read more. This might be a way of differentiating and let students kind of go freely and figure out what they can provide. Maybe they can build a story that would help others understand the story or novel or whatever it might be that you're talking about. So again, I think worth a look once you get used to using Google Forms. All right, this one is what I call guided practice. And along the lines of the build your own story, it does take a degree of really being comfortable with Google Forms in order to do this. But I'll tell you, if you are in the math, the sciences, I think this can be an invaluable way for you to help provide some guided practice. And so it does require the use of sections. So this is very, very similar to the build your own adventure. But what you're doing, if I go here and I preview this, so I think the preview kind of helps you. So what is 2.5 as an improper fraction? So if I say, well, it's 7/2, and then I hit next, it comes up and says, sorry, that's incorrect. Watch this Khan Academy video for help. You click on this. So now you give students that guided practice on what an improper fraction is, so that then they can, in this case, now try this one. What's 4 1/3 as an improper fraction? So if I say, well, it's 13/3, and then I do next, now I got it correct. And so if you think about how this can be used, and I just built this one example, you could have a variety of problems where kids are able to use this on their own as it says, guided practice. And really all it is being able to find a YouTube video, or not even a YouTube video, you making your own videos. That way you can tailor it exactly the way that you want it, and it becomes a way for students to be able to go back and make sure they understand it. And it really is this idea of, if I go down here and I create a section, and now I have, or let's do this. If I create another section, and now I say I want to insert a video, I go up and I, search. I'm just going to put, I don't even know, the War of 1812. And I'm going to find this, and I'm going to double click on that, and now I have this video. So I build it so that this question here is a question about the War of 1812. If I get it right, I don't necessarily have to watch the video on the War of 1812. So you would have it go to, you'd have it skip this section. If a student gets it wrong, then you have it move to section 5, then they're able to watch that video. You can have it then go back to the previous section so that they can answer the question right and continue to move on. Again, it takes some thought. I would highly recommend doing some kind of graphic organizer so that you kind of have that pre-planning. But it can be a way to differentiate. You could have a guided practice for your lowest level students. You could have a guided practice for your middle level. You could have a guided practice for your upper level. Again, there's no question that this is some upfront time. I would say you could have students work through this as well. and maybe even work with you to help put some of these guided practices together. So, again, I think it's worth looking at. I think it's worth giving some thought as to how this would be beneficial to you, maybe in your classes. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about as you decide when and how you want to use Google Forms. Again, I think a very powerful tool. I think a tool that is fairly straightforward to use. What I would suggest, a couple of things. One, if you come up with a great form, share it. You can share it by sending it to me, and I'll make sure it gets put onto Google Classroom. You can just yourself add it to Google Classroom, but really think about if you are a third grade teacher and you know that every third grade teacher covers the topics that you're dealing with in your Google form. Time is, I know time is of the essence. I know that time is, we're never going to have enough of it. And so if you can help another teacher, by all means do that. If you think of another idea beyond what I have, we're kind of limited by time here. If you think of another idea, shoot me an email and just say, hey, did you ever think about using Google Forms for this? Or how would I use Google Forms for this? I'd be more than happy to sit down and work one-on-one with you. If you'd like me to come in to talk to your students about how to build a Google form, all you got to do is let me know. I'd be more than happy to come in. If you have questions, and I think this is maybe that final thought, if you looked at this professional development and you are interested in it, but the pace was pretty quick, or, quite honestly, there wasn't enough detailed information, like, yeah, I like the ability of doing this build your own story, but he didn't provide enough in this to be able to do that, that's your cue to send Lori or I an email, and we'll be more than happy to sit down and work with you to help you design that, to help kind of walk you through that process. That's what we're here for. This online professional development is more to kind of get the brain working, trying to get you to think about new ways of doing things, but that doesn't mean that this takes the place of us sitting down one-on-one. So I hope in the end that this professional development opportunity was helpful for you. And again, we're looking forward to seeing some examples of the forms that you use in class.